All right, well, I hope you all are having a great day. I'd like to get started by explaining more about what we're going to learn in this course. And first, we have to really think about and reflect on why we have enrolled in a course about racial and ethnic minorities and what that means. Some questions you should start thinking about are these. One, why should we study race and ethnicity? Okay, so why is this important to you? What kinds of issues are affected by studying race and ethnicity? And do you see this happening right now in your own life where race and ethnicity is pertinent? In addition, we'll also look at how race relations have changed over time. In particular, as we've known in our own history, in history books and courses, we see different iterations and explanations of what has happened in history in regards to race relations. And in this course, we'll take an institutional approach on that. Okay. My second question is this. Do you think race relations have gotten better, worse, or stayed the same? And also reflect on why you think that way. Okay, so we'll talk about all these different questions throughout the course of the semester. So maybe one of the big issues that we are having now in terms of why we've had a problem with race for since the inception of this country is that we simply don't have the same language. We don't talk about race in a way that we can understand each other. Okay. Often, many of our problems in race relations stem from simply not communicating with the same language. So, what does that mean to you? What does ethnicity mean to you? We are going to use the meanings, these meanings to help us, and they're developed by social scientists. A race is defined as a group of people generally considered to be physically distinct in some way from others or regarded by themselves or others as a distinct group. Okay? There are two key points here. First is that groups are physically distinct. In the US, the physical markers that are primarily used are skin color, facial features, and hair texture. Have you ever wondered why these physical markers are used instead of other things like eye color? Well, we could create genetic races upon for simple things like earlobes. Are your earlobes floppy or connected to your face? This is a real genetic difference. We could create races dependent upon these things. Another thing is that can you roll your tongue or not? Okay. These are more genetic differences. There are more genetic differences within the same racial group than between racial groups. These markers are simply based upon convenience. When we first see a person, some of the first things that we notice about them are gender and gender presentation, race, ability, whether physical ability or whatnot, and their age. We make these assessments to determine how we should act and how we should treat that individual. To unpack the concept of race further, we must look at two components, the social and the physical. Okay? The social component involves group identity. The group must in some way be recognized by its own members or by others as a distinct group, or at least as having some characteristics being physical or maybe other characteristics in common. Without such social recognition, a group of people will not be identified as a race. Okay, so let's think about our own selves. How do you know what race you are? How would you describe that race? What does that race consist of? Again, this is all socially constructed, and I'll explain this to you further within the semester. Okay. So I would like for you to watch the video entitled Race, the Power of an Illusion on D2L. Here we see that genetically there are very little differences between races. Our genetic background is 99% identical. So let's think for a minute why we use race to make social distinctions. Again, race is not just physical difference, it also has political, economic, and social implications. And it's important to think about those things and why we still use race to determine different groups. Okay? So race is socially constructed, as I stated before. What this means is that race is a concept that we have created as a society and has no biological meaning. Racial classifications vary from time to time and from place to place. No pure races exist. There has been so much intermingling across fabricated national borders that we cannot say there is a pure race. Race as a distinct biological category is meaningless. Society makes choices about what physical characteristics are relevant. I would like for you to watch the video Eye of a Storm. In particular, I want you to watch how races were created. Okay. Next, often we hear the phrase, I'm colorblind. Take a moment to think about what that means to be colorblind. Next, think about why a person would state that. Okay? What does it mean when people say that we live in a colorblind society? Do you think that we live in a colorblind society? In a colorblind society, race does not matter and does not determine your life chances or opportunities in life. We are not in a colorblind society because the described statuses, the status of race does play a significant part in the opportunities in an individual's life. The consequences of race make race real. People do treat systems of racial classification as if they are real. For instance, the word race is so embedded into our culture. Although it's a social construction, the systems and institutions in our society affect groups of people differently simply because of what group they are born into. So I would like for you to watch the video Colorblind. We can see here that it is not wrong to notice a person's race. That is a part of who they are. What is a problem is ignoring the problems of living in a racist society. Next, so where do you belong? How do you identify? We have to fill out forms asking for us to identify our race and ethnicity. What happens if your race or your culture do not match? For instance, you could be Native American racially, but due to lack of proximity to other Native Americans and indigenous culture, and an individual may assimilate into European culture. This person may not have strong ties to Native American group. A racial group is a group of people who develop a group identity or common culture based upon race. Within any racial group, there can be a diverse way of expressing culture. However, without that exposure, an individual may not identify with that racial group. You do not need a strong group identity part of a cultural group to be a member of a race. Remember, a racial group is a type of social group, not a biological group. Race matters. Race matters because it has social and political consequences. Omi and Winnett theorize about this process using the concept of racial formation. Racial formation is a process by which society recognizes and defines social groups. This is not a static process. We as a society define how the meaning of race is understood. Again, race is a social construction. Another important component to racial formation is that the process defining is based upon political interests. Usually those without power cannot even name or represent themselves. How do you define race? How do you define ethnicity? Are there any differences? Unlike race or racial groups, physical traits are not necessarily characteristic of an ethnic group. That is, it is impossible to tell reliably on the basis of appearance alone who belongs to an ethnic group and who does not. Ethnicity is defined as a group of people who are generally regarded by themselves or others as a distinct group, with such recognition based on social or cultural differences such as nationality, language, and religion. Race is different than ethnicity, and that is passed on from generation to generation and cannot be dropped freely. Think about national holidays like St. Patrick's Day. It's great to celebrate Irish ancestry. However, it is not something that is easily identifiable outside of this particular day. Those with Irish heritage can drop it or put it on during or those with Irish heritage can drop it or put it on to distinguish the importance of other ethnicities when they choose to do so. Is ethnicity important? Yes. Psychological identification makes it real. This means if it is important in how you construct your identity, then it will be important to you. In particular, ethnic discrimination by others make people's ethnicity salient whether they want it to be or not. Ethnicity becomes salient because others with power have decided to make it so. We will see that when immigrants have come to the U.S. throughout history, their ethnic heritage set them apart and they were discriminated against. Over time, these groups assimilated to become more like the dominant group for a variety of reasons. We see today that race has become more important in individual and group identification. Next, we'll consider the terms majority and minority in terms of race relations. We often consider people of color minorities. What does that mean? Minority does not necessarily indicate a number. Historically, in countries like South Africa, the smaller population of Afrikaners or white South Africans were the numerical minority, but they had a greater proportion of scarce resources of wealth, power, and prestige. Based upon this characteristic, Afrikaners are the racial majority group in South Africa. A minority group is any group that is assigned to a subordinate role in society. This group tends to experience victimization, discrimination, exploitation, and political and economic disadvantages. In addition, the term minority can be a negative label because it's used as a comparative term. The dominant group or majority group is seen as the standard or normative group. Other groups are regarded as deviant and deficient. Also, minority can be an ambiguous label. Other groups are considered minority groups such as gender, sexual, and religious minority groups. Some of these groups are based upon ascribed statuses, and others are based upon choice. The term minority does not focus on systemic discrimination. Well, we simply just don't talk about this word racism, or if we do, it's a very, very tense conversation and awkward situation. We have had the problem of racism or white supremacy for 4 centuries. Possibly one of the major reasons that we cannot overcome the problems rooted in racism and white supremacy is simply because we don't want to talk about it. Think about why this is. What do people have to lose by talking about race or not talking about race? Maybe one of the reasons why we can't talk about racism is that we do not share the same definitions. Let's use social scientists' definition of racism. Racism is any attitude, belief, behavior, or institutional arrangement that tends to favor one racial or ethnic group over another. This is a catch-all definition. It is talking about beliefs and behaviors. What is important to note is that this term focuses on intentions and consequences. We often hear explanations that someone cannot be racist because they didn't mean it. That does not excuse We often hear explanations that someone cannot be racist because they didn't mean it. That does not excuse what happened. The unfortunate fact is that if one is a victim of racism or sexism, it makes little difference whether the disadvantage was intentional or not. It is still a disadvantage. Impact weighs more than intention when we consider systemic inequalities. There's different types of prejudices, and we should parse out exactly what we mean. Racial prejudice is a tendency to overgeneralize in some way, usually negative towards an entire group. When we are making generalizations towards a whole group, that is prejudice. Cognitive prejudice are beliefs about a group. This is about how you think about a group. Affective prejudice is a dislike of a group. This is about how you feel about that group. Cognitive prejudice is a desire to behave negatively towards a group. This is how you want to treat a group. Watch the video, Prejudice versus Discrimination, and notice the differences between these terms. Also watch the video, Gordon Allport's Nature of Prejudice, explaining why we are prejudiced. Another term that we must understand is ideological racism. Ideological racism is the belief that one's race is superior to another biologically, intellectually, culturally, temperamentally, and morally. Ideological racism is best understood as a means by which members of a dominant group attempt to make acceptable their domination of other groups. Unfortunately, the stamp of science has often been used to legitimize ideological racism. These ideas are used to rationalize or justify domination of one race or ethnic group by another. These ideas are so embedded into our culture that it becomes institutionalized or widely accepted within a culture. It is very difficult not to be impacted by ideological racism because we live in a racist society. One must work very hard to fight against making choices based upon ideological racist notions. When we think of racism, we generally think of individual discrimination. Individual discrimination is any behavior by individuals that leads to unequal treatment on the basis of race, ethnic group, or some other ascribed status. We think that racism occurs when one individual does not treat another individual fairly based upon his or her race. That does occur, but we must understand this term under historical and contemporary contexts concerning race relations. Watch the video is affirmative action against white people. We see here that the argument against affirmative actions is usually made without situating the argument in historical or contemporary context. In this course, we will primarily focus on institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination is any arrangement or practice within a social institution or its related organizations that tends to favor one racial group over another. Institutional discrimination may be conscious and deliberate. Institutional discrimination may be subtle and also unintended. Both forms of discrimination put forth obstacles that hinder racial minority groups from accessing political and economic resources. Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist. Watch the Sneetches. What message are you receiving? What does each character represent? And what does this story tell us about our society today? We will reflect on this cartoon in our discussion board.